Yes.
Yes.
Great. All right. So then I'll get started. So hi, my name is Shreya Narayan, and my team is working on the Ambumate, which is a device that will enable intensive care unit patients to walk. So each year in the US, 5.7 million patients are admitted to intensive care units, or ICUs for short. These patients are generally immobilized in bed, and that means that they're at risk for something called post-intensive care syndrome. So post-intensive care syndrome includes a variety of ailments, things like pressure ulcers, long-term muscle weakness, and deep vein blood clots. In fact, 40% of ICU patients, that's over 2 million people, develop post-intensive care syndrome each year. So ICU mobilization in the ICU has been shown by Johns Hopkins studies to prevent post-intensive care syndrome and improve patient health, ensuring that patients don't return to the ICU for a complication after their initial ailment has healed. It helps to prepare patients for life outside of a hospital bed. It also shortens the ICU length of stay, which saves both the patient and the hospital a lot of money. So walking or ambulation is one of the most important mobilization activities, but it can be a challenging process, and there are numerous barriers that limit how often ambulation can actually occur in the intensive care unit. So here I have a video showing the current ambulation procedure. So you can see from here that there are 5 clinicians that are needed to help the patient walk. I'm going to mute this quickly. Thank you. So 3 of these clinicians are only pushing equipment rather than assisting the patient in the actual procedure. You can also see that there's a dangerous amount of equipment that's been placed on the IV pole in general and at the base of the IV pole. So this is jeopardizing the stability of the equipment that is required for the patient to be held stable, such as oxygen or various fluids. There should not be this much equipment on the IV pole. You can also see in the background that there's a wheelchair being pushed behind the patient. Though the patient is clearly weak and may need this wheelchair for support or in case of fatigue, the wheelchair is instead being used to hold even more equipment that is needed for the patient. It would not be available to the patient if needed. So we identified several challenges with this current ambulation procedure. The first is that there's a need for patient support. Many ICU patients are weak, and even the active ambulation can cause severe fatigue that requires immediate support, which is currently not available. Second, there's a need in the ambulation method to have a system to manage the patient's wires and tubes. So ICU patients, as you've seen, have many wires and tubes for various pieces of equipment. The tangling or mismanagement of these wires is dangerous and a real threat using the current procedure, as there's no system in place to control these wires or organize them during ambulation. The ambulation procedure also requires a method to manage the many pieces of equipment tethered to an ICU patient. This generally includes vital monitors, ventilators, oxygen tanks, IV bags, and portable suction units. So higher equipment levels or more equipment mean that the patient generally has a greater need for ambulation, but that also means that there's increased difficulty for ambulation because there are more nurses and resources that are required to accommodate all of that equipment. Finally, we want to form a device that allows an ambulation procedure to be carried out with limited clinician staffing. Rather than using 5 to 8 clinicians for one procedure, as you saw in the video, we'd like ambulation to be possible with the assistance of only 1 clinician for all patient equipment levels. And right now, there is currently no device that satisfies all these needs. So our team created the Ambumate. We have partnered with the head of the Pick You Up program, which is a program and a network of 70 pediatric ICUs promoting patient ambulation, to create the Ambumate, which is a device that meets all of these ambulation challenges in an ergonomic way. Our device is capable of carrying all the equipment needed by the patient and includes a mechanism to integrate with the patient's current IV pole. Our device can be maneuvered easily by a single nurse. It involves a novel system for wire and tube management that prevents tangling and provides slack to prevent tubes from being pulled out of the patient. It integrates seamlessly with the current clinical workflow, and it provides various methods of support for the patient in case of weakness or fatigue, eliminating the need for a wheelchair to follow the patient. So we've completed some initial IRB testing that has shown that our device is effective in mitigating the challenges associated with the ambulation process. And we are currently finalizing our prototype to finish IRB testing at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. So the data here shows nurse feedback to a variety of metrics describing the maneuverability, the safety, and the efficacy of our device in ambulating patients in the Johns Hopkins Pediatric Intensive Care Unit. From the results of all the nurses who participated in the study, our device was rated as very good or very high for 54 of the metrics, and good or high for 32 of the metrics. Any ranking of poor or below was not selected by any nurse for any metric. So our team has been working for the past 3 years to develop the cart that we've just described, and Ambumate is in a prime place for market entry and success. So our cart will qualify as a Class 1 510K exempt device and will therefore not require any pre-market approval, which will help streamline the process of bringing our product to market. The Pick You Up initiative, the program that I told you about with a network of 70 hospitals, gives Ambumate unequaled access to a nationwide customer base. And we plan to enter this market by working first with our clinical sponsor, Dr. Kudchakar at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, to sell the Ambumate to the Johns Hopkins Pediatric Intensive Care Unit. JHU is the head of the Pick You Up program. So by proving the device's efficacy here first, we'll be able to expand to regional PICUs in Maryland in 2021 and a wider range of Pick You Up hospitals in 2022 and beyond. After 2022, we see potential to expand into new markets in the general ICU, the general hospital floor, and rehabilitation centers, where a similar need for a therapeutic ambulation device is needed to enable improved recovery and healing. So our projection estimates a total addressable market of at least $1.2 billion and a sale of over 245,000 Ambumates. So here's our management team. We began as a design team with the Johns Hopkins Biomedical Engineering Department, but we've continued the project because of our passion for its potential use and assistance in intensive care units. Our advisor is the head of the Pick You Up Clinical Research Program at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, Dr. Swapna Kudchakar, and the design of our device is guided wholly by the feedback that we've received from nurses struggling with ambulation challenges there. We have connections with current Baltimore medtech companies, and we're hoping to be able to work with them to manufacture our device. We hope to use any funding that we receive to move forward in this goal in creating a device that will help ICU patients walk and thereby heal better than any other device on the market. So thank you, and I welcome any questions you have for me now.
Hey, Shreya, can you go into your market size a little bit? Are you hoping that every PICU buys 2 devices? Is it patient-based? What's kind of the market size? And also, can you touch on how many PICU patients are even eligible for ambulation?
Right, so the first question, how many would each hospital get? So we first envision having 1 Ambumate for every 5 hospital beds. And so this would allow hospitals to kind of gradually bring the Ambumate into use. So I do have some numbers. So currently there are about 77,809 ICU beds with 3,155 hospitals in the US. And so ideally each patient would actually have their own Ambumate, but we first intend to start by having 1 per every 5 hospital beds. And your second question, can you repeat that one?
Yeah, so are you targeting PICUs exclusively or ICUs as well? And how many patients on average would you say as a percentage are even eligible for ambulation?
Right, so we first wanted to target pediatric intensive care units simply because our clinical sponsor is the head of the Pick You Up program, which is centered around pediatric ambulation. But really the device is applicable to every ICU. Every patient, to answer your second question, is eligible for ambulation. The studies that I mentioned at the Johns Hopkins Hospital showed that ambulation of any form, whether it's walking or standing, is very effective at preventing post-ICU complications. And that's not limited to how serious the patient is. As you saw, the patient in the video had a lot of equipment needed. He was a very seriously ill patient. But even that act of just walking down the hallway is very effective. And so as long as the patient is able to do that, which most patients will get to that point at some point in their care, the ambulation is effective. So yes, it will be effective past the pediatric intensive care unit, which is why we will expand to the general ICU and then general hospital floor. And it's, to answer your second question, it's applicable to all patients as well in the ICU.
Do you have a prototype you've brought into hospitals and actually seen that you can get it down to just one nurse? I was trying to imagine how, you can actually do that much. And I guess my second question on that is, when you are now looking at adult ICU patients, do you need to change your prototype at all to handle larger patients, or do you anticipate maybe just a second nurse is needed?
Sure, yeah. So to answer your first question, yes, we brought the picture on the left here is part of our IRB study. So we had one of our team members standing in as a patient, and these are actual nurses who are testing it out and using the cart. And we put all the standard pieces of equipment like the ventilator and the different monitors, the IV pole, the IV bags, and connected it all to the patient, as you can see, with like clips that weren't actually connected, but having that connection kind of simulated. And the device was actually able to move it all down, and we asked periodically the nurses if they would feel comfortable continuing on their own, if they needed the help of another nurse, and they always said that they would be able to continue on their own, and I have some data I can show with that later. And for your other question, do we have to accommodate? We believe we have designed the device so that there are patient support mechanisms on the side so that the patient can hold on. There's one lower down for pediatric patients and one higher up both for the nurse and for older patients, so that part would not need to be revised. We can similarly integrate the wire and tube management system at a higher level for the ICU patients, so really there's not much change that needs to be there. We also did research on the chair that we have for patient support that can be taken out of the cart and sit stably on the ground. And we did research on the height of that chair and how that changes based on how old the patient is, how tall the patient is. And we found a size that really should work for everyone based on the research, based on the appropriate seating, height and everything. And so the translation from the pediatric ICU to the general ICU should be actually fairly simple. And to answer your other question, this was data we had on how many nurses were needed. And this was a preliminary study with an initial prototype, but it showed that the time to set up was lower and the number of nurses needed was lower, especially for higher equipment levels. So we see our device being especially useful for higher equipment levels where originally more nurses needed. And so now that does reduce it down to about one.
Hey, Shreya, it's good to see you again. I know you competed last year, so thanks for competing again. It's great to
thank you.
See you persisting. What changes have you made since last year is my first question. And
sure.
Two, what are you looking to protect specifically from an IP perspective? And ultimately, how does that create a barrier to entry for really large corporations like your Strykers and your Medtronics and the other folks that sort of kind of compete in the space already?
Sure. Yeah. So to answer your first question, the changes we've made. So we went to the hospital and did further IRB studies to see the feedback from different nurses. And they've said that they'd want a specific place for oxygen to be placed because the current oxygen holders are not doing the job correctly, or it needs to be dragged around. So we're implementing that into our design. We're also making changes so that the pull-out mechanism for the chair is a lot smoother, and then the wire and tube management is a lot smoother. We wanted to verify that those mechanisms were preferred by the nurses. And so once we verified that, which we have done with our studies last winter and in the spring, we're looking at changing those in our prototype, really just finalizing it because we do have the kind of foundation of it completed. We have been working with Johns Hopkins Technology Ventures to pursue IP. So the idea is that we would pursue a patent for the mechanisms that we use for the patient support. So the chair and the wire and tube management system specifically, those are very key parts to it. And obtaining a patent through them to protect that technology in that way. I think from our talks with our advisor at Johns Hopkins Technology Ventures, he said that once our device is finalized, as we're doing right now, we can get a better idea of what we can include in the sphere of our IP, so that it is protected in that way, and then that way we can license it to other corporations.
I think my key concern is probably around what is considered a barrier to entry, right?
Right.
Listen, you can anybody can write a patent. And, and I'm actually in the middle of doing that with my organization. I have to challenge my team members to say, okay, it's not enough to just write a patent. What is going to prevent our, my biggest competitors or prospective competitors from encroaching on my space by, making one minor change and calling it novel and not obvious?
Right. So that really comes to our connection with Dr. Kuchakar. So we have a really unique ability to market to all of these pediatric intensive care units. The Pick You Up initiative is a new initiative started by Johns Hopkins that extends to 70 hospitals across the nation. And this is
but time is up for questions.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'd like to answer your question later if possible,
Sure.
but
Thank you.